In a small brick apartment building in Portland, Oregon, 78-year-old Margaret Ellis begins her mornings the same way she has for the past 12 years. She wakes before sunrise, not because she wants to, but because sleep no longer stays with her. The silence does. The apartment is tidy, almost too tidy. A crocheted blanket rests perfectly folded on the armchair. Framed photographs line the hallway. Her late husband Thomas in his Navy uniform, her son Daniel in a Little League jersey, her daughter Claire in a graduation gown, smiles frozen in time. Margaret moves slowly now. Arthritis stiffens her fingers, and her knees protest each step toward the kitchen. She makes oatmeal, the plain kind, and sets 2 cups on the table out of habit. Then she pauses and quietly returns 1 cup to the cabinet. Her children live far away. Daniel works in Seattle, always in meetings. Claire lives in San Diego, balancing her career and 2 teenagers. They call, sometimes, usually on Sundays, if they remember. Margaret never complains. When the phone doesn't ring, she tells herself they must be busy. When holidays pass with only a mailed card, she tells herself flights are expensive. When her birthday arrives with a text message instead of a visit, she tells herself this is just how the world works now. But in the evenings, when the sky darkens over Portland and the rain taps gently against her window, she sits in her armchair and stares at the silent phone, waiting. Not for money, not for gifts, just for the sound of her children saying, "Hi, Mom, we were thinking about you." And in that waiting, loneliness grows quietly, like a shadow that never quite leaves the room. One Sunday afternoon, Margaret set the table for lunch as she always did. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans seasoned the way Daniel used to like when he was a boy. She even placed her phone beside her plate, screen facing up. Claire had promised to call at noon. Daniel had said he would try to join. Noon came. The clock ticked louder than usual. 12:07, 12:23, 12:41. Margaret kept her posture straight, as if someone might walk through the door at any moment. She didn't start eating. It felt wrong to begin without them, even if they were only voices on a screen. Finally, at 1:12 p.m., her phone buzzed. A message from Claire. "Sorry, Mom, emergency at work. We'll talk soon. Love you." Margaret smiled at the screen. She even whispered, "That's okay, sweetheart," as if Claire could hear her. Daniel didn't message at all. The food went cold. That evening, while washing dishes alone, Margaret felt something unfamiliar tighten in her chest. Not physical pain, though her heart had been fragile since her minor stroke last winter, but something heavier. She realized she had started planning her weeks around calls that rarely came. She rearranged doctor appointments to stay available. She skipped church coffee hour in case they called early. She declined invitations from neighbors because Sunday is family time. But Sunday had quietly stopped belonging to her family. Later that week, Margaret visited her physician for a routine checkup. Her blood pressure was high again. The doctor gently asked if she was feeling stressed. Margaret laughed softly. "Oh no," she said, "my children are just busy." But that night, as she sat in the dark living room, she admitted something she had avoided for years. It wasn't busyness anymore. It was distance. And the space between them was growing wider than she knew how to cross. The rain in Portland grew heavier as autumn settled in. Margaret began forgetting small things, not dramatic things, just little slips. She left the kettle on the stove once until the metal bottom burned dark. She misplaced her house keys and found them later inside the refrigerator. She told herself it was normal. "Everyone forgets at my age," she whispered. But the silence in her apartment made every mistake feel louder. One evening, she decided to call Daniel instead of waiting. Her fingers trembled slightly as she dialed. It rang 4 times. Voicemail. She tried Claire. This time, Claire answered, but her voice was rushed, distracted. "Hi, Mom. Is everything okay?" Margaret hesitated. She hadn't planned what to say. She just wanted to hear her daughter's voice without waiting for Sunday. "Yes, sweetheart. I just wanted to check in." There was a pause. In the background, Margaret could hear traffic, maybe children arguing. "Mom, I'm actually on my way to a meeting. Can I call you later?" Margaret swallowed. Of course, I didn't mean to interrupt." After they hung up, she sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at her hands. Interrupt. That word echoed in her mind. Had she become an interruption in her children's lives? The following week, Margaret slipped in the bathroom. It wasn't a dramatic fall, just a misstep on the tile, but she hit her hip hard enough to leave a deep purple bruise. She lay there for a few minutes, stunned more by fear than pain. For the first time, she thought, what if no one finds me? Her emergency contact listed Daniel, but Daniel was 3 hours away by plane. Claire was even farther. Margaret didn't call them about the fall. She didn't want to worry them. Instead, she ordered a grab bar online and waited for a maintenance worker to install it. She told herself she was being independent, but in truth, she was shrinking her world, room by room, so she wouldn't need anyone. And the more she tried not to burden her children, the more invisible she began to feel. Winter arrived quietly in Portland, wrapping the city in gray skies and early sunsets. Margaret stopped cooking full meals. It felt pointless. Instead, she ate toast, canned soup, crackers with tea. The refrigerator grew emptier, just like the rooms around her. The church ladies noticed she hadn't attended Sunday service in weeks. One neighbor knocked once, but Margaret pretended she hadn't heard. She didn't want questions. Questions required answers, and answers required admitting she was lonely. Then, just 3 days before Christmas, the power went out during a storm. Margaret sat in darkness, wrapped in her late husband's old navy blanket. Her hands shook, not from the cold, but from something deeper. She picked up her phone. No new messages. She opened the family group chat. Photos filled the screen. Claire's children decorating a tree in San Diego. Daniel's office party in Seattle. Laughing faces, bright lights. She typed, "Merry Christmas, my loves. Miss you." She watched the screen. No immediate reply. The apartment felt smaller than ever. The ticking clock stopped when the power failed, and for a moment, time itself seemed to disappear. Margaret's chest tightened again, stronger this time. She pressed her palm against her heart and tried to breathe slowly, the way the nurse had taught her after her stroke. Tears rolled down her cheeks, not loud sobbing, just quiet, steady tears. She realized something painful in that dark room. She had spent years protecting her children from her loneliness. She had hidden her falls, hidden her fear, hidden her need. And in doing so, she had slowly erased herself from their daily lives. For the first time, Margaret whispered the truth out loud. "I don't want to be strong anymore." Her voice cracked in the darkness. And in that moment, without lights, without noise, without distraction, she felt the full weight of waiting, not just for a phone call, but for someone to truly see her. The power eventually returned, but something inside Margaret had already gone dim. The morning after Christmas, Margaret woke with swollen eyes and a quiet headache. Her phone lay beside her pillow. 3 unread messages. Claire, "Merry Christmas, Mom. Sorry we missed your text last night. Things got crazy here." Daniel, "Love you, Mom. Let's plan a visit next year." And a photo of her grandchildren opening gifts. Margaret stared at the words, "Next year." She suddenly understood something painful but clear. Her children loved her, they truly did. But love from a distance had become convenient, scheduled, efficient, and she had allowed it. That afternoon, there was a knock at her door. It was Mrs. Hernandez from down the hall, holding a small container of homemade soup. "We missed you at church," she said gently. "Are you okay?" Margaret almost said yes. The automatic answer was already forming. But something in her, the part that had cracked in the darkness the night before, stopped her. Her lips trembled. "I'm not as okay as I pretend to be." The words felt heavy but freeing. Mrs. Hernandez stepped inside. They sat at the small kitchen table. Margaret spoke slowly at first, embarrassed by her own vulnerability. She admitted the fall, the loneliness, the waiting. She even admitted how much it hurt when her calls felt like interruptions. Mrs. Hernandez listened without judgment. "You're not a burden," she said firmly. "You're a mother, and mothers forget they're allowed to need too." That evening, Margaret did something she hadn't done in years. She called both of her children, not to check in, not to be polite, but to tell the truth. Her voice shook as she spoke. "I don't need you to fix everything," she told them, "but I need you to understand that I'm getting older, and sometimes I'm scared." There was a long silence on the other end, not distracted this time, just quiet. And for the first time in a very long while, Margaret felt something shift, not in her body, but in her courage. She had stopped waiting silently. She had chosen to be seen. The days after that conversation felt different. Not magically fixed, not suddenly full, but different. Daniel called 3 nights later, not on a Sunday, not scheduled in advance, just a simple Tuesday evening. "Mom," he said, his voice softer than usual, "I didn't realize how much you were holding in." Margaret sat by the window as rain slid gently down the glass. She didn't accuse him, she didn't list her pain like evidence. She simply told him about her fall, about the dark Christmas night, about how the apartment sometimes felt too quiet. Daniel was quiet for a long time. "I'm sorry," he said finally, and this time it didn't sound rushed. Claire called the next morning. She cried when Margaret described lying on the bathroom floor alone. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked. Margaret gave the only honest answer she had. "Because I didn't want to slow you down." That sentence lingered between them. Within weeks, small changes began to happen. Daniel arranged for a medical alert system to be installed. Claire set up a weekly video call, not just for 10 minutes, but for dinner together over screens. They marked it on their calendars the way they would an important meeting. Margaret, too, made changes. She returned to church coffee hour. She accepted Mrs. Hernandez's invitation to join a small knitting group in the building's community room. She even began taking short walks in the park again, her cane tapping gently against the pavement. Her world did not grow larger overnight, but it stopped shrinking. Some evenings were still quiet, some calls were still missed, but now, when Margaret felt lonely, she said it. And when her children said, "We're busy," she replied gently, "I understand, but let's find another time." She was no longer waiting in silence. She was participating in her own life again. And slowly, carefully, connection began to return. Not as it once was, but as something new, something honest. Spring arrived in Portland with soft sunlight and blooming cherry trees. Margaret stood by her window one morning, watching petals drift onto the sidewalk below. She realized she hadn't stared at her silent phone in weeks. It still rested on the table, of course, but it was no longer the center of her world. Daniel visited in April, not for a holiday, not out of obligation, just because he wanted to. He noticed the grab bar in the bathroom, the medical alert device around her neck, the knitting basket beside her chair. "I didn't see how strong you were being," he admitted. Margaret smiled gently. "Sometimes strength looks like silence," she said. "But that doesn't mean it's healthy." Claire and the grandchildren came that summer. The apartment, once too quiet, filled with laughter and footsteps. Margaret moved slower than she used to, but she no longer hid it. She let her grandchildren steady her arm. She let her daughter cook dinner. She let herself be helped. One evening, after everyone had left and the apartment returned to its familiar calm, Margaret sat in her armchair again. The room was still quiet, but it no longer felt empty. She understood something now that she hadn't allowed herself to see before. Love doesn't disappear when children grow busy. But if parents hide their needs, love can drift into assumptions. Margaret had spent years waiting to be noticed. What changed her life wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't money. It wasn't a perfect family reunion. It was honesty. She stopped protecting her children from her reality, and in doing so, she gave them the chance to step closer. That night, her phone buzzed softly. A simple message from Daniel. "Good night, Mom. Talk tomorrow." Margaret smiled, not because she feared the silence anymore, but because she knew she was no longer invisible inside it. Growing old had taught her many things, but the most important lesson came late. Waiting quietly is not the same as being loved loudly, and sometimes the bravest thing a parent can do is say, "I need you."